Hi, and welcome to Inquiry with Rita and Meradj. Today we are talking about the only thing that there is to talk about, which is Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
And we have many thoughts about everything. So we are excited to share them.
We're excited to share them. The structure of this episode is going to be that first, we're going to talk about why this is so terribly sad for Ukrainians. Secondly, we're going to talk about the less appreciated perspective, why this is so terribly sad for Russians. Then we're going to give our analysis about why we think this happened, what we think the upshots of this might be, and what an appropriate human individual reaction to this whole ordeal is.
Yeah, so the first thing is just that this is a really sad situation for Ukraine. And I mean, that almost goes without saying, so it feels a bit lame to try to describe it. But obviously, it is just horrifying that people have their territory invaded and have tanks on their streets and have rockets firing outside, people having to flee their homes or people having to be separated from their families so that like men can stay and like defend their city. I mean, it's just unthinkable to imagine having to do that in our daily environment.
Yeah. And I guess we should say that today is like the 27th of February, Sunday, so we don't know when this is going to be up. And there's going to be supposed peace talks tomorrow. But I mean, even in best case scenario for the people of Ukraine, they're just going to be like traumatized for life, you know? And I think that's because I hear a lot of people are now talking about how, oh, this might not turn out that bad for these people, perhaps they can like stalemate Russia after 2 weeks of fighting. But still, we're talking about thousands of people who have died, people who have had their homes destroyed. And I think it's hard to just fully appreciate the trauma of having to like flee your country in the middle of the night as rockets are exploding and the type of impression that leaves on the human soul.
Yeah, I mean, especially because it has been an ongoing military aggression on Ukrainian territory by Russia. And of course, there has been this kind of civil conflict and military unrest and some violence and so on. So it's not like, oh, everything was 100% peaceful, but I think it's just, the escalation of the current situation is just of an extremely high magnitude. As I understand it, I don't think any Ukrainian people really expected that this would happen. They thought that Putin would need to like have some kind of excuse, that there would be some reason that it just was really unexpected that he would just be willing to launch this full on like invasion just so blatantly outright and such like aggressive hostility. And of course, like at the same time, while maintaining that they're trying to denazify or just trying to call it a conflict or military operation or special operation and whatever languaging that Russian state media and Russian state insists on using, rather than calling it what it is, which is just a straight up invasion of their and war on their territory.
Yeah. None of this has been to consider kind of like more bad case outcomes for Ukrainians, which would just involve many thousands of them dying and never being able to return to their homes. So, of course, this is beyond tragic situations for all the people of Ukraine, and it's really sad.
Yeah, it is really sad. And I mean, the uncertainty, I think also that's really sad, right? I guess it feels lame to say this, but it is just so scary for, because, okay, 150,000 people have fled into the Poland or something, or EU countries, but there's 40 million people in Ukraine. So obviously, the vast majority of all people who live in Ukraine are still in their home or have traveled at least like outside their cities or something, but are completely caught in the middle of the situation with no knowledge about how far this might go and what's going to happen for their country next politically. And I think that just complete destabilization of what you take for granted, like, and having all of your plans suspended. I mean, we all have experienced that, how just traumatizing it was to have COVID, like cancel all the big events and cancel all gatherings and stuff. So that combined with all of the violence and uncertainty, it's just really horrible and really tragic.
It's really sad for all the people of Ukraine. Not really much more to say about that than what has been said here. It's very sad. But something that has gone perhaps underappreciated, although not acknowledged, is how sad this is for Russian people also. Ain't that right, Rita?
Well, I mean, I do feel that obviously it is easier for me to be sympathetic to how awful this is for Russian people, being a Russian person myself. Like, I don't mean like, oh, it's so sad for Russian people, so let's not see this as a problem, or let's be really sympathetic to them for like invading and murdering. Like, I mean, that's not the point.
Yeah, and of course also you didn't mean that it's more sad for them than for the Ukrainian people. You just meant that you're more, since you're Russian, you have more of a perspective to see how sad it is as a Russian person who has to live in that country already under Putin, and now this happens also.
It just seems like a very tragic situation because the Russian military is conscription based, so all young men have to serve 2 years in the military. And as far as I understand it, I mean, I've never lived in Russia as an adult, but as I understand it, it's very difficult to get out of the conscription. So it is like very mandatory. So that's kind of, the military is just full of young people, and it is a very difficult institution with a lot of like hazing, and people die every year. So it's a very like tough institution. So I think it's very difficult, obviously, for young people who are conscripted to go fight in a war. I mean, it's awful for them to fight in Ukraine. Any war is really awful because you have to go and murder people. And I mean, really sad for the people in Russia that don't approve of the war, because many people don't approve of the war, don't want the invasion of Ukraine, don't want this aggression, but there is very limited ability to really influence the government.
There isn't a viable opt-out option for many people in conscription-based countries, right? And I take it that to be especially true in Russia. Point being, it's not like you can say, oh no, I don't feel comfortable engaging in this war, and then expect for there not to be severe consequences to your physical well-being, the well-being of your family, your ability to thrive as a human being. And I personally can't wait for like the boomers to stop sending young kids into the wars to die. I think it's like quite impressive how now somehow, for some reason, boomers has been like the one sending like young kids to die since the 80s all around the world. They've managed to send young Gen Xers, millennials, and now Gen Z people to die, and hopefully this will be the last boomer who does so. Although I guess Biden still has an opportunity, and they could always re-elect another old guy in the US, I guess. But always very sad seeing just these pictures and videos of these 18, 19-year-old people who just look really confused, being coerced or forced to go and
It's
kill
just
other
crazy
people.
because I saw something about some of the people that were captured and they were born in like 2002, and I'm like, you can't be born in 2002 and be like in the military. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, it's
I mean, I'm
insane,
not that
yeah.
old. I'm born 1990, so I'm not like old.
Yeah.
But still, I'm like, you're a baby. You shouldn't be invading a country and threatening a bunch of innocent civilians and burning down people's houses
Yeah.
with like grenades. I mean, it's just the horribleness of war for everybody involved. It's just really awful. And I think also like the tricky pickle for just Russian people that, I mean, I think like makes me really sad, because obviously I just have more knowledge of this situation, but it also makes me sad as a human being thinking about all of the different authoritarian and coercive regimes we have on Earth. So it's really not just about the Russian people, it's just about like, here we are again. Because it's like, what are the Russian people supposed to do? It's like, yeah, they can go to protest. Like thousands of people go out to protest in cities that have millions of inhabitants, right? It's a very small turnout rate for the protest. People are really scared to protest because people are often arrested just en masse when they protest. They are violently treated by the police. Like, they are literally beaten. They are threatened. You know, obviously, like, it takes a lot of courage to go out and protest in that kind of environment. And that's the environment Russia has been in for a really long time. So it's not like they haven't really tried protesting. It's just that, like, people do lose the spirit over time, and that's how it is in every authoritarian society, right? So it's also like, that's not something that the poor Russian people are grappling with that other people aren't. But it's like, if you don't have free media if you don't have freedom of association, like you can't just start any association in Russia, right? It has to be all government approved. If you really struggle to get a career as a journalist unless you're working for like the propaganda state media, I mean, then when bad things happen, there's so little recourse because it's like there's little like really independent media. There's kind of like micro bloggers and some platforms, but like, you know, not the powerful authoritative voices maybe that could like really galvanize people. There's so many people who are completely just taken over by the state propaganda. So they're like, yeah, let's invade Ukraine. They're Nazis, you know, and that's really horrible. Because like tons of Russian people, millions of Russian people really support Putin. They support everything he does. And you can talk about how like people are just down this rabbit hole of misinformation, just like we have like the QAnon people in the US or whatever. But it almost, I mean, at that point, it's like, doesn't matter if they're victims or not, if they're supporting a literal war, it is hard to have sympathy for them, but at the same time, like you do, right? And that's kind of just the case, not in Russia, but everywhere in the world. There's just really hard situations with authoritarian regimes because it always cuts off options for people to like demand change. And then the circle of possible action for people just keeps getting smaller and smaller. And then bad things happen. And then it's like, what is the recourse?
Another aspect, or perhaps even the predominant aspect in which it's sad for Russian people, is just how, I mean, I take it to be trivially true about like all people that in any given geographical area, the vast majority of those people just wants to live safe, happy lives where they can enjoy like material goods, hang out with friends, feel secure in their physical and mental well-being. And given just how hard Russia is going to be sanctioned and how isolated they're going to become after this, because we already know, right, that they're getting kicked out of SWIFT. They have been like they've been kicked out of like the UEFA. I think they're getting kicked out of the World Cup. They're losing access to Eurovision Song Contest, losing FIFA. They're gonna lose all of this like access to like goods of all various types. They're gonna really become kind of like to some extent a rogue state. It's just going to be hundreds of millions of Russians who are just completely normal people whose lives become so much worse because of this. And that's, of course, very sad for those people and for the world.
Yeah, it is really sad for everybody. And I mean, not to like make it a comparison game, but obviously it's even more sad for the Ukraine people.
Yes, of course.
And like, yeah, so of course, I mean that, but I just want to bring it back a bit to the Ukraine people. That is, of course, just like really heartbreaking to think about like what is even the best case scenario for Ukraine after this. You know, what are the futures for this for all the people there? That is just really sad to think about. And we talk a little bit about what we think the implications of this are, right? But I think first we wanted to talk a little bit about why we think this is happening, kind of like the Putin logic and just the general concept.
Yeah. So I mean, people presumably have seen the kind of like general idea, which is that I think at least the general idea that's been out there for a lot of people is that, well, Putin, he has felt like threatened by NATO enclosing on him, and then Ukraine, starting somewhere around 2010 already, started taking a bit of an EU shift. They were like more interested in becoming like a quote-unquote Western country than like a primarily Russian and Eastern allied country. And this really like scared Putin. And then of course we saw Crimea annexed in 2012, I think. 2014. Oh, yeah, 2014. In response to him not wanting to lose access to like kind of like the seaports, and the Ukrainian response after that has been to further like turn towards the west. They were flirting with NATO membership, and then one part of the narrative is that this just kind of like forced Putin to go in, and then there are people who are using kind of like the same logic here, but they don't use language of Putin kind of like being forced to go in, but they use language as that this is what made him go in. But
yeah, or like that he had no recourse.
no
That it's kind of
recourse.
like the logical outcome.
The rational outcome of being a hashtag rational actor on the political scene in a hashtag political realist world. Then, of course, there is the economic story at hand also, which is that Russia has oil, or like they sell a lot of gas, and part of that gas is accessed but via the Ukraine area, and that Ukraine was like jeopardizing Russia's ability to get full access to this gas, especially with the new Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And so there was like this economic reason to go in to secure what is the main part of Russia's economy, i.e. the gas supply to Europe and to the rest of the world.
And I thought you checked something about like that this was like a really large percentage of their economy, right?
Yeah, it's a really large percentage.
It's like 30% or something.
Yeah,
like
it's
crazy.
just like it's just the main part of the economy. Not the majority, but the plurality.
The largest, the largest sector.
Largest sector in the economy, just by far. Right, and this was in jeopardy. Now, of course, these two type of logics, they can like intersect, right? So you can see how the NATO gives some reason and the economics provide some reason. And then there are, of course, also the reasons that have been very much part of the Russian justification. And I think there are like, I don't want to say it's like true, but there is some truth to it, which is that there were these like two states, or like two areas in Ukraine who were declaring themselves to be part of Russia, or like independent states. One of them was this Donbass, or so I can't pronounce that, I'm dyslexic. And that there's been kind of like conflict between them and the rest of the Ukraine. And that part of the conflict from the Ukrainian side has been spearheaded by quote unquote National Socialists, i.e. Nazis, who have been violently fighting and killing a bunch of Russian ethnic people in these regions.
I'm only like laughing because it is just like something so weird about like Russia and Ukraine fighting each other about like who the real Nazi is, given that they're both like victims of the actual Nazis. I don't mean to like laugh at all about the actual military situation anyway, but it's just like, I don't know, it's just like something like, I do find it impossible to find like no humor in real life situations, and it is something like really bizarre about the whole like obsession of Russia with the Nazis, and this like being their their greatest military victory, and that it's, I don't know, like reflects a lot of like online, it's like how everything always devolves to people accusing each other of being Nazis, but it's like in real life, like with actual lives at stake, it's like so surreal. And weird. Yeah, sorry. But okay, go on. It was just, what you're saying is super interesting. I just think it's so weird.
So all of these reasons can like intersect, right? Now, let's just like say something more about the Nazi justification used by Putin. Because it is a very big part of the Russian narrative of why they're doing this. It's almost the main part. So I think it's interesting. Sorry, now I'm just kind of like a bit going off track here. But I think it's interesting, and we're going to return to this in a more detail well, that this whole like, oh, they're doing it because of NATO, that was like a part of the Russian narrative early on. But that really dropped away quite early. And here later on, it's been way more about the Nazi stuff, about how they're like protecting themselves and the Ukrainian people from these Nazis in Ukraine who were trying to build the dirty bomb, and who were trying to build weapons of mass destruction. Hashtag they got that one from the Bush administration. But I just think it's interesting how that became the main part of the focus. But I guess that has to do with, as you said, that the fight against Nazism has this deep historical tie in Russia.
Yeah, I mean, like the victory of the Soviet Union over the Nazis really can't be like overstated. in terms of its cultural political significance, I mean, still yearly parade on the 9th of May commemorating the victory of the Soviets over the Nazis. I mean, and that was a the Nazis, they were like the worst. So, obviously it makes sense this is like a really big deal. But so I just think it is important to understand that like the concept of like Nazis and fighting the Nazis is something that is very easily weaponized in Russia. I guess like an analogy to America, it's a bit like freedom. Like in the US, you can do a lot if you're like, we're spreading freedom, and that's a really powerful slogan. And for better or for worse, like obviously people are way more cynical about the US military right now and what they do and what they don't do. But the idea, like, I mean, before, the idea that the US could like go in and liberate countries and the US is this watchdog of democracy and US is protecting democracy used to be a big part of like the American image. So it was something that could be really weaponized militarily. So I think that's like a good comparison to this idea of like how powerful the idea of like denazification is for Russia. Even though, like as I said, it just feels so surreal to be bringing that up as the justification for this.
And I mean, we want to be clear here that there is like some truth that there were some Nazis in Ukraine. There are some Nazis in Ukraine, and these people have killed Russian ethnic minorities. That's very sad. There's arguably also some truth to the extent that the Ukrainian government didn't do enough to protect these people, but it was also hard how they were going to do enough to protect these people because those people were saying that they weren't a part of the Ukrainian nation anymore, but that they were breakaway regions. But it's just like unequivocally the case that it makes zero sense for this to be the pretense to go in to Ukraine with, because this Nazi party in Ukraine, they got 2% of the vote in Ukraine. They hold no members in parliament. They control no institutions. Ukraine's president and prime minister are Jewish. Ukraine has the largest Jewish population of any European country. When you look at how favorable they are towards Jewish people, they are significantly more favorable towards Jewish people than every neighboring country, including Russia. And Russia have their own white national fragments within their society that are larger than the fragments within the Ukrainian
You mean that's
society.
what I was going to say. It's like if the idea is like we need to go in and liberate these people from their far right party, it's like so you just invade with that pretext. You can invade every European country now. Basically, come liberate us from like the Swedish Democrats, right? Or alternative for Sweden. So I mean, it's like, the idea that there is some political segments that are oppressing people and that you need to invade the country to liberate people from that oppression just is non-viable, I think.
Not viable at all.
But that is the official justification. To be honest, I am not following the official justification much. I've seen a lot of stuff about they're trying to say it's not a military conflict, it's just a special operation. They're trying to fix things. There's not nearly as much fighting as Ukraine is trying to say. Everything is peaceful and it's no big deal. That's as far as I've gotten. And I do try to stay away from like the Russian state media and the Russian stuff because it just upsets my little heart. So I don't want to like claim to be educated all on what the official arguments of the Russian people are meant to be.
Then, that's a good way to live your life, I think, because you will go a bit unhinged if you read too much Russian state propaganda. But let's just finish this segment off by one important take that we think is true here, which is that it does not make sense to view the story of how this happened through a materialistic conception of politics or international relation. And the ultimate reason, which is to say that invoking kind of like NATO's encroachment and or the economic reasons for why Putin invaded Ukraine is just structurally unable to explain how it came to be. And the reason for why this is the case is because Ukraine wasn't really close to joining NATO. That just wasn't the thing in reality. B, insofar as like Putin doesn't want to have NATO missiles on their border, they have NATO missiles right next to their capital, right? Because Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia and Poland are all in NATO. Like, there's no significant Russian cities near Ukraine compared to the significant Russian cities that are near already
Sorry, I don't know
existing.
super much about this, but isn't there something about how like NATO doesn't have missiles in the Baltic states though? Like I thought that was part. I mean, like I know like they're in. I don't know. Sorry,
Yeah, no, I mean,
maybe I'm confused about this. But I thought like a big thing was that they specifically were not going to place any missiles there.
Yeah, but okay, but for that same reason, they wouldn't have missiles in Ukraine. So
Okay,
it's
yeah.
like
Yeah, no,
if there
fair,
are missiles,
fair.
if there would be missiles in Ukraine, they would be in the other countries also. So the point being here is if the reason is we can't have missiles or we can't have NATO next to our major cities because they are then within striking capacity, that reason is already operative. So that can't be the justification, right? Or that can't be the explanatory reason. So the NATO thing doesn't really make sense. Moreover, the only way in which the NATO thing could make sense was if Ukraine joining NATO cut them off from the access to the Black Sea. But they took Crimea, so they already have the access to the Black Sea that they need. So that doesn't really make sense. Then you could think that, yes, the economic reasons make sense to some extent, right? Which is to say that, yes, it's true that if he controls Ukraine, he's going to have way more access to the gas, and if he has a friendly government there, or if he has an unfriendly government in Ukraine, there is the potential of there being some problem accessing the gas and running the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. But of course, the reason why that doesn't really explain the situation is because, yeah, Putin must have understood that he was just going to get so sanctioned from this that it couldn't have outweighed the countervailing benefits. Do you know what I mean? Like this, he must have understood that if he invades a European democracy full scale, the sanctions would be so hard that there's no way he could have thought this would like benefit him economically in any way. So the only way then in which this makes sense to explain the situation is to not invoke a materialistic conception.
Well, some people like also just think that he's crazy. You know, Putin be crazy. Putin, he's not logical. He doesn't think about stuff.
Yes. Now, I guess that can't be like ruled out. You know what I mean? Because bitches be crazy, and Putin is a bitch, like in the worst possible way. Like,
I think it's unfair for bitches to be compared to
yes.
Putin.
Well, what we mean is that he's a hyena, and he's a bitch in the sense that hyena are dogs which are terrible, in that sense.
Okay, good.
Yeah, but I mean, we can't rule out that he had like a brain tumor, and then invaded Ukraine. But what we think that there is a very clear explanation.
Okay, so I'll take the explanation. So I think like our thinking is just to do with more this Putin kind of psychology politics game where he's like 70s, like 69, whatever, he's old guy. He is maybe reaching towards the end of his political career. I don't know, and I guess he feels that the economic upgrades that he was able to make in Russia and the political upgrades, whatever, isn't enough to cement his legacy. I mean, it's a huge thing, the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? Like super traumatic for people that were a member of the Soviet regime. And I guess he just wants to reclaim the territory to solidify his like greatness and his legacy and make sure that he is really, I don't know, makes it front page in the history books. I guess that's the idea. Because he has already gotten himself his $100 million yacht and built himself a palace and, you know, ruined everything. So it feels like he doesn't really need to do this. But I guess like if he's just driven by this desire to really like be remembered and make history by like expanding the Russian territory, then that is a kind of action like a legacy that is hard to match through other stuff, like trying to, like, I don't know, improve the economy a little bit or try to improve the birth rate a little bit. It's just like less impressive. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah. So I mean, I guess the basic take here is that like Putin clearly really views himself as like a great person of history. You know, as this like person who took it upon himself to like fix Russia after their fall of the Soviet Union and the Civil War, and views himself as a very important historical figure. But those people, they never become remembered for kind of like the small fixes and or slash improvements that they make within a society. But what really like writes someone in to history is always this empire building. And empire building is always synonymous with expanding the territory of the empire. So ultimately, yeah, we just think that he has like, he's reaching the end of his life. He's like contemplating how he will be remembered. And he just realized that with everything he's done so far, he probably won't be remembered for that long, you know. He probably like, when will, I mean, he might be forgotten he will be remembered that, oh, that was like Russia's president and he did some stuff. But that how he wants to be remembered is like Catherine the Great, or Peter the Great, or Stalin. These like really historical figures who really like solidified and expanded the Russian Empire. And to do that, he just realized he needed to take more territory and fold it into the Russian Empire.
Yeah, and I mean, I think those considerations about his desire to leave this like geopolitical legacy and to kind of shore up Russia as this military, geographic superpower, whatever, it makes the current conflict really scary because it's like, why would it end with Ukraine following that logic, right? Because you can be like, oh, well, you know, Russia and Ukraine, they have this history, and, you know, because the Kiev and Rus, it was the seat of the Russian civilization. And it's like, okay, I mean, it is like undeniable that there is some sort of historical association between the countries, but it's also like there's a lot of historical association between. I mean, Sweden doesn't like go taking Norway, even though it's the same country, and like, you know, we could access a lot of oil or whatever, right? It's like that's just not really how it works today. Like, you don't just, that's just not how it works, right? So just the fact that there's some sort of proximity or some reasons why a person might want the countries to be like united is not enough of a reason to invade. So then it's like, where does it end? Because then it's like maybe he could take all of the former Soviet republics and incorporate them back into the Russian Federation, right? And then it's like, but and that's really crazy.
Yeah. And if you looked at his speech, when he ultimately gave this like speech for why he did do what he did, he didn't talk about NATO, he didn't talk about economic incentives, he minimally talked about Nazis, but what really talked about was restoring the Russian Empire. And of course the restoration of the Russian Empire does include the Baltic countries, because they were Russian for a large part. And it does include like, yeah, Poland and Georgia and all of those places. So if that's his motivating reasons, then there are very little reasons to believe that it would just be Ukraine and nothing more.
Yeah. So scary stuff. And I feel like that leads us directly into our next topic we wanted to talk about, which was the greater geopolitical social implications of all of this, which we feel are just like so big and very, very overwhelming.
Super overwhelming. But I mean, perhaps we can begin by taking the most obvious implication, which, or at least what I think is the most obvious implication, but which for some reason hasn't gotten like sufficiently discussed, we feel like, which is namely the death of the interdependence theory of international relationships.
Yeah, and that's super important. So can you like explain a little bit more
Yes,
about
so
that?
since 1990, since the fall of the Soviet Union, the thing that has really dominated international relations and how we theorize about that is the theory of interdependence. Now, this was a theory already before, but of course you had Soviet Union there, so there was a very real way in which separate parts of the world wasn't at all interdependent. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, the whole thing has been like, we globalize, we interconnect all countries together. If all countries are interconnected sufficiently, they're interdependent, meaning that the success of one country is gonna always be tied to the success of multiple other countries. So if one country does something bad, that country is gonna affect other countries. So they have reasons to prevent that from doing something bad. But more importantly, if a big country, if they do something bad to another country, given that they are interdependent with that country, and given that they are interdependent with the rest of the world, the badness is kind of like gonna come back to bite them, because they can't just unilaterally do something bad to another country without also harming themselves. And given sufficient interdependence, it will never be in the rational calculus of an actor to engage in war. So we have seen wars, of course. We have seen the US invade Iraq, and we've seen them invade Afghanistan.
We've seen this huge war in Syria.
In Syria, by other countries. But there the whole point has always been, well, there hasn't been sufficient interdependence. But in Russia, in the case of Russia's and their relationship to Ukraine and rest of Europe, there just clearly was supposed to be sufficient interdependence, right? Because, well, they are such big trading partners, Russia and the rest of Europe, Russia and Ukraine, super big trading partners. We already talked about how big of a gas export Russia are to the rest of Europe, and how they would have known that the sanctions would have been really, really harsh for them. They have been really big trading partners with Ukraine. Ukraine has a population of 40 million people who buy a lot of goods. They go vacation in each other's places. They're also interdependent via culture and language, and all of those things really play in to the extent in which it doesn't make sense in the rational calculus for Russia to engage in war with Ukraine, but yet they did it. Now, of course, this is important for two reasons. First, we think this really underscores the fact that it doesn't make sense to have this materialistic analysis of why this war came to be. But second, and more importantly, perhaps, and what hasn't been discussed so much yet, is that this really ruins the veneer of how states relate to each other in the international arena. And you might be like, oh, but they could still go on relating that way. But we don't really think this is the case, right, Rita?
For me, it's just like, it is a violation of the concept. I think that's part of the reason why people want to just like talk about how Putin, he must be really crazy, right? Because it is like going against the logic. I guess that's why people want to talk about how irrational or illogical he is, because obviously the interdependence logic, it just makes sense. Like, I mean, as we human beings, I don't know, collectively evolve, like you just have to acknowledge that, like, just like how we depend on our environment and we should be caring way more for the environment, we obviously really depend on each other to succeed. So it's just better for the world if we collaborate rather than like have an adversarial relationship to each other. So when a country who presumably has been profiting from collaborating decides like, nah, I'm gonna go the other way, it does feel like it's not just one incident of a person being crazy, but it feels like it's going to lead to further conflict when other countries also are like, well, okay, I'm also going to take this opt-out route. Well, like, either this situation means that other countries have to like go all out to completely like annihilate Russia, to like set the global precedent that like it's really not worth violating this collaboration norm, which is really horrible, because obviously not only horrible for Russia, but also horrible because the more you cut Russia off, right, the more they have incentive to be super hostile, adversarial, like, kill people, destroy things in Ukraine and elsewhere. So that's just like really bad. But then on the other hand, if we don't do that, then it encourages other countries to be like, yeah, I mean, why collaborate really if it's possible to just go in and take what we want militarily, or just to set up like a much more, create like this adversarial diplomacy of like we versus you, and we'll just find our own way, and we don't need to be part of your global payments network or whatever.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. And here's like a subtlety to that, which is that I think part of any global framework of relating to each other, or just generally any framework of relating to people, isn't only the consequential logic of that framework, but it's also the belief, the prior belief in the consequential logic of that framework, if that makes sense.
No, what does that mean? Sorry,
So what that
didn't get
so
what
what
you're saying.
so what that means is not only the fact that yes, there is within an interdependent international framework. It's not only the fact that you truly do get these benefits by cooperating in this way, and this negative upshot if you violate interdependence. That is, if you do something bad toward countries or with countries in which you are interdependent. But it's also part of the strength of the system is also the trust that other countries will think this way.
Okay, yeah, I get what you're saying.
Yeah, so it's this like prior belief that when you
that
start,
like we all collectively have agreed that it's like off limits to go like invading a country.
yes, because we all believe in this logic. We all believe this is a logic that works and it's the right kind of logic.
Yeah, and then like we see we all understand that it's just like senseless to try and go against it.
Yes.
Because it's like it's not gonna go well.
Yeah.
But here's like a person that's like, well, I don't think so. I think it's gonna be better for me to do it this way.
Yeah, exactly. So now there's just this prime example of an actor who had like every reason not to do this, according to the interdependence theory, but who did it anyway. So that just makes all the other countries lower their credence in this way of relating in the first place.
Okay, well, what do you think like are the real like consequences of that?
Well, so I think like the real consequences of that are that countries, bigger countries, are gonna be more, for lack of a better word, like hawkish and bullish to smaller countries, and smaller countries are gonna be more non-trusting of like bigger countries. And I think this might not be like have the hashtag biggest effect like in Europe or whatever, but I do think this can have like significant effects in, for example, parts of Africa. And I think that's why like the Nigerian spokesperson at the UN was real, or what they were really going for in their address to the UN, which was like how there really must be like shown swiftly and directly that Russia doing this doesn't change the general logic of relating to each other. Because in Africa, for example, all the countries there, they were really drawn up by the colonizers. So there's like a similarity that many African countries have with Russia's relation to Ukraine, which is where it is like there are ethnic minorities in those countries that probably, like, if you went by a true division of land, or like a natural division of land, would have been in another country, and there are language groups in other countries which better belong to other countries. So there are all these kind of like cultural, ethnical, linguistic, religious reasons for why many countries in Africa would want to expand their territory. But the reason they don't do that is because they have really subscribed for good reasons to this international framework of that we don't do this because we are interdependent with all other countries in Africa, and this is not something we do in the within the international world order. But if this is something that people now do within the national world order, if this is something that people are allowed to do, and if the response to that, the Russia's violation here, is a response that is partially distancing itself from the interdependent framework right? So if it is, for example, countries now doing more their own thing because they're distrustworthy, how could that look like? Well, that could look like, for example, Russia or like Germany increasing its military budget unilaterally outside of NATO and the EU. That could look like, for example, France increasing its military budget unilaterally. That could look like, for example, other countries seeking aid elsewhere within Europe, and just like things like that. Then the whole belief in the system breaks down, and then there is this like greater propensity for risk and violence in, for example, many parts of the world.
And
Like
I guess it's just awful also because China also kind of has its own adversarial rather than cooperative attitude, even though they are very cooperative and very integrated into the global supply chain. So it's like, I guess it's all part of a bigger trend of just generally like unraveling stability of global institutions. That's very scary.
Yes.
Yeah, and it feels really big. I definitely see what you're saying. Yeah.
And I think the important thing to notice with this Upshot is that Upshot is to like a large extent really independent from how things unfold now in the coming weeks in Ukraine.
What do you mean
Russia.
by the Upshot? Sorry.
Oh, this like the reduced credence in the current international world order and the extent to which it's built on like an interdependence framework is really has taken a hit,
Yeah,
regardless of the outcome in the war between Ukraine and Russia. Just meaning that, you know, it could be, for example, tomorrow that like Russia and Ukraine, they sign a peace treaty and like Russia withdraws and Ukraine is not neutral and the military conflict is over. But this damage would still be done to significant
totally.
extent.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah. So, but then there are of course plenty of outcomes that could also be really bad, mostly really bad, not really good, that really depend on how the situation gets resolved, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. So yeah, I totally see what you're saying about like the bigger consequences for other continents. I'm like not at all just familiar or like understanding anything about the current situation in like Africa, so I really feel like very hesitant to comment on that, but I totally follow your logic on it 100%. I'm just thinking about like how I feel like there's just going to be really big consequences for the security situation in Europe. And I just don't see like, it just feels like the consequences will be so big because either the conflict in Ukraine is going to get drawn out, like the war, and then I don't know like how much like they're going to escalate the war violence. I mean, thinking about the Crimea conflict, it lasted like a month or something. So, and that was a region that was very like populated by Russian speaking people and did have a lot of like historical like belonging to Russia. Not that Russia like is allowed to take it, but it's more like, you know, it was more plausible that Ukraine would cede that region and kind of be willing to let it go than they would like be willing to take down
the country go.
Yeah, exactly. Well, like, I mean, yeah, cancel their government and install a pro-Russian government, right? So obviously the war and the violence is going to get drawn out for a long time. I mean, that's really awful. And then it's like, what is really the scenarios? Because it's like either Russia wins and then they just have some sort of pro-Russian government installed. And obviously it doesn't end there because you can't just install a authoritarian government, you know, that, you know, the like feels like the conflict would continue internally for the Ukrainian people between them and this like government tension, right? Because we even see so much just conflict, civil unrest and stuff in Belarus where they've had this dictatorship for so long. But then it's like, if they win in Ukraine, then where does it end? Where does the Russian expansion and invasion end? I mean, what do you think about that?
I think it's so hard to say to some extent because I think like a lot of things really depend on how it goes in Ukraine, if that makes sense. So I mean, if we take for like best dream case scenario, which is
I would love to hear the best case scenario.
Well, the best case scenario is that tomorrow on the peace talk, Putin is just like, I fucked up, guys, I did wrong, and withdraws, and Russian troop withdraws, and things are kind of like back to normal, except that Ukraine will never trust Russia again. No state will ever trust Russia again as long as Putin is alive. But this is just not going to happen, right? This is just like the best case scenario just isn't going to happen. So what is like the most realistic best case scenario? Well, it's that either on the peace talk tomorrow or kind of like in a coming peace talk after further escalation and killing and murdering and barbarity, you get kind of like a quote unquote neutral government installed in Ukraine, which isn't allowed to go to the West, but it shouldn't be too close to Russia either because it's neutral. But this just in practice, right, means that over time this government is going to become more pro-Russian, because that's literally what happened in Belarus. And it also just means that the people of Ukraine have lost what I think kind of like is the most fundamental right of a human being, which is the right to self-determination to some extent. And then, of course, in this best case scenario, we're counting that Russia suffered like really heavy losses to their military. So they feel like another attempt at expansion within the next 5 to 10 years isn't like worth it. And this thing being like the best case scenario just seems like incredibly bleak to me. Do you know?
Totally.
Okay, then there are like, it's like, I guess like unfortunately there are like scenarios which are more realistic than that, but also are worse. So I think like a more realistic scenario is, for example, that Russia doesn't install this like neutral government, but that they try to annex all of Ukraine. And this might very well be a hashtag mistake for Putin, in the sense that it might really undermine his ability to govern within the next 10 years, because you have this like long drawn out insurgencies within Ukraine from like Ukrainian resistance. But I mean, this is just awful, right? This is just, then we're talking about just 20-30 million people who are in a constant war zone, and that seems horrible.
Yeah, I guess the predictions on what's gonna happen, we can just leave that.
Yes.
Because it's just, there's, all of them are awful, and it is so early in the conflict that it's really hard to tell how it's gonna play out. Yeah.
But let me also, if it's okay with you, if it will just take like worst case scenario.
Of course.
Yeah. So worst case scenario is that they get like an easy victory here. And I know we're all, and me included, I get caught in the trap and being like, oh, Ukraine, they're resisting so good. And the Russia's military, they're so incompetent. And just look, they're gonna like stalemate them. And it's gonna be horrible. Blah, blah, blah. But I think it's really important to remember that like Russia's military, they are going like really carefully forward. In the sense that, and this is not like, oh, US is also bad. But it's just true that they aren't carpet bombing Ukraine to the same extent that the US carpet bombed Iraq when they invaded Iraq. But it's important to remember that despite the US carpet bombing of Iraq, it still took them 3 weeks to take Baghdad. So this like initial slow moving Russian advancements right now, even though they are like for some reason slower than what people thought, because Russia invoked the term blitzkrieg, and for some reason people think that the blitzkrieg are like when Germany took Denmark and it was over in a day, but the blitzkrieg is more like 2 to 4 weeks time span. So they are still on the timetable for a blitzkrieg. They could still have it within 3-4 weeks, and that would still count as an easy victory for them. And the worst case scenario is that they get that and they feel really emboldened by this. they get a bunch of bloodthirsty generals who are like tasted war and the sweetness of marching around in Ukraine, feeling that they are like.
And I mean, to be fair, they have tasted some of that already, and like they're the parts of Georgia that they've taken over, and the Crimea occupation.
Of course. But now they get this like, look, we took this entire country.
It is on a whole different level,
And Putin is like, wow, this was quite easy, I'll just now have the playbook. Perhaps he takes Moldova, perhaps he takes Georgia. And this is like, people like, oh, you're just like, catastrophizing. But I mean, the US State Department, they're like fearing this, right? They're just saying that they don't believe this is they don't believe the plan was just Ukraine. They believe that the plan was like Ukraine easy, then further expansion. And this makes sense for this to be the plan, because he must have #priced in the fact that he was gonna be so heavily sanctioned that to offset those sanctions, the best way is just to take more economic territory.
Yeah, exactly, to expand the new economic sphere of influence that they do have.
Yeah, and of course one really good way to always offset economic sanctions to a country or economic damage to kind of like the capitalistic sectors of a country is to just #invest in the military. So you just like pump up the military, and the more you employ even more people in the making of military gear, military equipment in the military itself, so you get a larger military. And then the fear then is that within like 4 years perhaps he uses the same playbook on the Baltic countries, who also have Russian-speaking ethnic minorities.
I think for me, like definitely Latvia seems like a important Russian target. I mean, they only have like, what is it, 1-2 million people, something like that, and I think 40% are Russian speaking. So it definitely feels like a big target for Russian like semi-invasion that's not a real invasion, so it doesn't like fully trigger NATO. And I think like that is like a really big fear for me, that like whether like actually for me it's like regardless of how things go with Ukraine, and even regardless of how Putin expands into like Moldova or Georgia, which of course like it's just horrifying from the war aspect, but I'm thinking about like the bigger geopolitical aspects for me is like the idea that there are like ways to really undermine NATO significantly. Which really weakens just the current security situation in Europe, meaning like, all of this feeling that like peace is just taken for granted goes away. It just feels very like real that's a really big risk in the next few years. Feels like as long as Putin is around, like, I mean, his goal is to like undermine NATO. And it seems like he has some strategies open to him for how to do that.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, we have some friends in Latvia, and we know some people in Georgia. And they have straight up been telling us that if he gets an easy victory in Ukraine, and that doesn't mean he takes Ukraine within the first week, but it means that he, within like a month's time, has gotten sufficient control over Ukraine to the extent that they effectively control the governing aspect. They are saying that they will just straight up start like preparing to leave their countries, because then they expect to be invaded. And that's of course horrible, right? And if he has Ukraine under control, there are also so many ways in which he can utilize that territory and control to undermine the EU in like many ways. Of course, this is like speculations, but he could, for example, try to strike a deal with Poland or Hungary, which are very anti-EU states already.
Not that they're like pro-Russia. I mean, especially not Poland is not pro-Russia. But I mean, like they like kind of like this flirting about like being anti-EU and pro-EU simultaneously.
And being moral fascist dictatorships themselves. They love that.
Yeah, exactly. Being oppressive. So there's just definitely a lot of potential for him to politically, culturally undermine the EU. And undermine like the NATO, the principle that like everybody's going to defend you. Because I mean, it's just not clear. NATO, of course, is saying that they will do everything to protect all NATO countries, but like, I mean, it is horrible to escalate things, and then the nuclear things can, so it's all very frightening. I guess, like, I think ultimately, like, the big summary to summarize it is I just think that there are a great number of like very serious security implications. And even though obviously we just don't know like what's going to happen at all, it's clear that just by him invading Ukraine, like the geopolitical calculus has changed significantly for countries, as you said, in like undermining the trust in interdependence. But like not only there, but it just feels like it's not over. It's not going to be over with just Ukraine, no matter what. And that just really, again, feels like, you know, we're starting a new chapter of global instability and conflict at a time when, like, I don't have the bandwidth to deal with that.
No, of course. Yeah, I think that was a really beautiful summary. And of course, it's like finally the real most catastrophic implication or upshot here is that Germany has increased its military budget with 100 million euros, and Germany spending that much money on its military is always somehow bad in the long run. Because, yes, I don't need to say more there. I think we all know what is being said. But the final thing that we want to touch upon is how should one as a individual relate to this whole situation. And I feel like you there have some really beautiful thoughts.
I do. I don't know if I have beautiful thoughts, but I have thoughts because I feel like it's similar to the Corona dance we just have been through, where it's like you go online and you see what your friends are saying and you try to talk to your friends and you're kind of surprised by how people react. Like personally, I was quite surprised when we went to the protest against the war that there wasn't really a lot of people there.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a few hundred people there.
Yes.
But compared to protests in other European cities, it just seems a little bit underwhelming given how near Russia is and how it poses like a constant security threat to Sweden by like flying over our airspace and coming over here with submarines and stuff, right? So it just seems...
just 2 days ago being like straight up, if you guys try to join NATO, we'll bomb you.
Yeah, which has never happened before.
Yeah.
Like they have never explicitly had a Russian official threaten like Sweden before. So it's a new level of aggression, but people here seemed a bit underwhelmed.
Yeah.
So I guess, I don't know, I don't know if I have answers. I just thought it would be fun to talk about it because I think like one thing is like, I just wonder like to what extent we can really like expect people to care. And I thought it would be fun to talk about that because you're like a philosopher. So what you talk a lot about to me that I've learned from you is this concept of like moral partiality. And how we necessarily weigh, or like not necessarily, but how we tend to like weigh things as more important if they concern us more directly, right? So like obviously you care more if your mom gets hit by a car than if a random person gets hit by a car because your mom is like closer to you, and why we care more about poverty in our neighborhood than poverty in a different part of our country or in a different part of the world, right?
Yeah.
That it's just like we are attuned more to things that are happening near us. And I've seen some people on social media and stuff saying it's like problematic that it's this way because we should be showing like, why aren't people showing this much like compassion or mobilization for the war in Yemen or like, you know, like the Israel like occupation of Palestine or something. So I just thought that was like interesting. It sparked some thoughts in me. What do you think?
No, I mean, okay, it's a lot there. I mean, I think it's, well, let me say like this. I think if you don't care about this deeply, and I mean like really like, if you aren't like
as a European,
as a European specifically, but also as a person of the world,
okay, as a person of the world
who has like time, who has a stable life, so like they don't have like immediate dangers and threat in their vicinity, so you like live in a kind of like stable country. This can be America, Canada, Australia, whatever, India, all of those things. I'm not like obviously if you live in Somalia, this shouldn't be your concern. I mean, that's a given, right? But if, barring living in those types of countries, if you don't care about this situation, you just are not well enough informed. I think that's true, and it's a bit embarrassing. Because it's just historically true that the worst thing that we know for the world is war in Europe. It is just like the worst, actually. because we all want to pretend.
But not because it's like white people are the best. But then because I see people saying
Yeah.
this, I'm not saying you think this at all.
Oh, I think
I'm
the
just
white
saying,
opposite.
yeah, no, but it's
Because the
just I
white
see
people are
online.
like the worst.
No, but I see people online being like, oh, people are upset because it's like white people who this is happening to. And I'm like, but it has nothing to do with like that. It's white people who shouldn't be subjected to war. I wasn't at all implying that's what you believe. I just have seen people saying like, oh, you get upset when it's like white people who have to go to war. But it's like, that's not the problem. The reason it's scary is because, yeah, they're like the worst.
Yes, it is because... And they have so much capacity for being the worst.
Well, and also because of the interdependence, right?
Yeah.
I think that's what we talked a bit about that like, as with the financial crisis in the US, right? If something goes bad for the economy in Europe, US, it has really negative implications for the rest of the world that are more significant because the economy is just such a big part of the global economy.
Yes. That's 100%
so I mean, that's just also like a big thing, is that war is bad for the economy.
For the economy.
Which feels very, like, gross in my mouth because, people are literally dying. But also, like, people literally die when the global economy goes bad, right? That's the problem, is that people really lose their livelihoods, lose their security, lose their health, lose their lives all around the world. So it is, like, a huge significant issue. So fine, everybody should care around the world. Okay, I get it.
Yeah.
But I'm like...
Well, just one more point on that.
Yeah.
I just really want to underscore that people should care, and they should like wake up in the night from their night terrors, sweating through their sheets as I do. Because like if things go bad...
I'm not doing that.
Okay, but you should.
Me a bad person.
Yes, 100%.
Whoopsie.
Because, I mean, as I do have, it just wouldn't surprise me if, in 10 years, the EU, it's like devastated. Suddenly England, they're reclaiming the colonies. Germany has invaded Poland. And just like things are like going to hell. That's just, I don't think that's like that of an unrealistic scenario, because that's what happened when these fucking white people in Europe decide like, oh, it's time to go to war. This is what they do. We know they do it. We're not that far away from everyone doing it. I think it's like on the table.
Okay.
Yes. But, so as an individual, you should care.
I guess
lot.
I hear you. I think my reflections were more like, I don't know, I was thinking about how people are kind of just exhausted from the pandemic and things being so hard. And I know, for example, people in Europe are very involved emotionally with like racism issues in America. It's really interesting, which obviously are like really significant. People suffering is really bad. But I know in Sweden, people are like very emotionally invested in a huge way, in a way that they're kind of burned out from the political tensions in America and the racial tensions in America, even though we're here in Sweden. And then the COVID. So I feel like people are kind of like burned out,
Yeah.
But it's also like, but I hear that kind of a lot. And I mean, so on the one hand, I totally feel that. And I just feel like, if you don't have the bandwidth to like follow the news for a couple of weeks, I don't think that makes you a bad person. I don't think you need to have anxiety nightmares at all.
Well,
okay,
you do and you don't.
No, I don't.
Okay.
I think it's really good to kind of care for yourself. And if you're feeling like, if you're feeling like you've been just like living on the edge of your seat, refreshing the news for like the corona death count for the last year, I think it's at least like understandable why it feels like too much to also deal with this. But then it also feels like, isn't that, history is like one damn thing after another, right?
Yeah.
It is kind of like, there is no end, because there's like the environment catastrophe.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of current ongoing conflicts. Like the rise of China is frightening in many ways because they're a very oppressive, very powerful country.
Yeah.
So it's like there's just a lot of things in the world to care about. So I guess like I've been reflecting a lot on how the solution isn't like to care less about Ukraine, to save your caring points for other situations, but that it's kind of like we as humans kind of owe it to each other to like develop our capacity to like care about things more and like take care of ourselves in a way so that we can be open and care for others. So that's something I've been thinking about.
Yeah.
How we can do that, and how I've been thinking about why it's so important to talk about these like Ukraine things like on my personal platforms, which are not at all related to politics, because it is kind of like when things happen close to home. You know, for me personally, obviously very close as a Russian person, but also close as a European. So like when things happen close and you have this moral, was it?
Can I come in here? Because you had a very good point, and I just remember you saying that point to me. And I just want to articulate that. Is that okay? Yeah. So, because I remember I was getting a bit upset. I was getting a bit upset, even though I really understand the concept that you are morally allowed to be partial to the things which are more approximate to you. I was getting a bit upset how much people cared about the Ukraine situation. Because, like, why do people care so much less about, for example, the suffering of, which country is it that Saudi Arabia is bombing? Yemen, and, you know, Syria, and all of those situations. I think you made a really, like, excellent point there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I was trying to build up to. Where I was talking about how I just think we all have to develop. No, don't be sorry. No, don't be sorry. I was just saying, like, I think I was trying to build up to talking about how I think it's important for us to develop our just general caring capacity. Because it is like, it is wrong if we're like, I have 10 caring points. And I'm going to allocate 9 of them to Ukraine. And that means I only have 1 caring point left over. Because it's like, there is just so much going on in the world, and people who live in countries where they're mostly safe and things are mostly stable, it's like it's so easy for us to get caught up in like, well, like I don't have perfect economic security, or like, you know, we'll never be able to afford an apartment, which are like totally valid and important concerns, but also like it just can't be that like despite how far our country has come in providing so much stability, security for us, that we still have like this complete poverty of like caring points, and we have this very like limited pool to like care about the world, you know? So I think I don't have any answers. It's just this conflict was really, the invasion into Ukraine really sparked thoughts in me about like how we collectively, like what we can do to like increase our caring capacity and to be more caring. And I do think that, as you said, like focusing on how much we can care about Ukraine and doing what we can is probably good, because instead of like depleting our caring resources, it's about building our caring muscle. So that's my final statement on that. And also, but the racism also comes up in this like, oh, yeah, I don't really care about this because, you know, Russia, Ukraine, it's kind of the same country, haha. So
there's some people who are racist because they.
And I'm not saying the racisms are equally valid. I'm just saying I think it's always sad whenever there's conflict and you realize just how much racism like affects the way we interact with the world around us.
For sure. So, for example, a lot of people, they will feel like, well, it doesn't really matter if I post a picture of Ukraine, or if I change my profile picture, or even if I go to a protest because I'm just one person. There's an active war. I don't see what my participation in protest is going to change. Right? And to that, I want to say like 2 things. I think firstly here is like definitely a clear example of how protests just really matter, actually. Because if you look at the first sanction package that the EU were going to put in place, it was like quite small, and people got super upset, right? And people, like in Germany especially, they were just screaming in the hundreds of thousands on the street. They were like, don't you have any shame? You know, cut the ties with Gazprom. You must cut off Nord Stream 2. And the day afterwards, the German politicians were like, okay, we're going to do this now. So here's a good example where protests really do have an impact. But I wouldn't say, even if the protest in your country perhaps doesn't have an impact, such as in Sweden, it's like unclear.
Well, the Swedish government did send a lot of like the supplies to Ukraine.
No, of course, yeah. But I was saying it's like unclear whether they did that because we protested. Do you know what I mean? Because the protests weren't that big. And Sweden, since we are like neutral assholes to some extent, we don't care that as much as we should. But so one reason for still protesting, I think, even in those contexts, is that I think you really get this kind of like moral duty to distance yourself from the bad guys. So the way I think about it, if you don't protest now, then like when would you protest?
Yeah.
You know, if not now, then when? And then if you factor into that equation the fact that other people are protesting, so for other people they're really like taking the stance, this is bad, I'm super much against this. I'm against this to the extent where I devote hours of my free time to stand in the cold and chant just for the small probability that the government will do something that will have a small probability of impact. This is how much I care. If you're then being like, well, you know, I don't care sufficiently, then I think you're like kind of like, the moral landscape has changed in such a way that what it means to care appropriately is to protest. So if you're not protesting, you're not caring appropriately. So the fact that other people kind of like up their level of care actually places more demand on you to care. Does that make sense?
Totally, yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
So I think that's a non-consequential reason for engaging in protesting.
By non-consequential, you mean like even if your protest had no significance, you just have this like moral
duty to care appropriately. And caring appropriately here in this context seems to me
that.
Well, I mean, I think it's important to remember that two things. One, this situation is actually like a lot more significant potentially than many other situations. So if not now, when? But secondly, there is no moral standard on perfect consistency, right? So just because you care a lot about this situation doesn't mean that you have to care equally about all situations in the future. So you don't have to feel bad. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me. And I think also like thinking about things on a case-by-case basis where it's like you don't need to be committing yourself to how you're going to protest for the rest of the year or the rest of whatever, but it's just about thinking like, does this feel right? Does this feel important to me now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, that's how I was thinking about it.
Yeah.
Okay. I feel like that's the end of the episode.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.
Bye.